Hi BookTube, and welcome to a recent reads for 6 books, all in translation and with at least 3 5-star reads among them, so pretty good recent reads. Bedraggling Grandma with Russian Snow by the Portuguese writer Joao Reis, translated by maybe it wasn't translated, maybe he wrote it in English, I don't know. Cees Nooteboom, a Dutch author. This is called The Following Story, translated by, please tell me who translates this. Yes, Ina Rilke. Another Dutch author, Willem Frederik Hermans, An Untouched House, translated by David Colmer. A Ivorian writer, now resident in France, so good that you just need one word for his name, which is GauZ. This is called Standing Heavy, translated by Frank Wynne. Philippe Claudel, Grey Souls. This was translated by Hoyt Rogers. And finally, my second Georgi Gospodinov novel. This is called Natural Novel, translated for the Bulgarian by Zornitsa Christova. Okay, so I'm going to start Bedraggling Grandma with Russian Snow by Joao Reis. This was recommended to me by Bob Black, a frequent commenter on my channel. And one of the things about it was that it seemed to have some overlap with my own novel that I'm currently writing. So it's a series of police interviews. Two policemen, one of them is sleeping with the other one's wife. The cuckold likes to do nothing more than read Wittgenstein, which is kind of what led me into fancying this book. And the various people who pass through the interview room where they're trying to solve a murder of a woman. The first witness is a mechanized donkey that has been built by a Russian emigre engineer. This takes place in Montreal, I ought to say. And it's sort of human in every facet of its knowledge, the information that it has sort of been downloaded with. But of course, it would fail the Turing test because it's not human. It doesn't have the range of emotions, and it can't feel, has no nervous system. And it was placed on the windowsill of the apartment opposite where the murder happens. So already it's slightly sort of surreal that you've got police sort of interviewing this talking toy donkey. And then the police decide on 2 suspects that they think could have done it simply because they're sort of in the proximity, and the other interviews are with them. And this is where Wittgenstein comes in, because the cuckolded policeman tries to use Wittgenstein to prove that one of the suspects did it, and it was pretty funny. But this book is really sort of very light, very fluffy. It reminded me of Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman, and I really didn't like The Third Policeman. And ultimately, it was really only the Wittgenstein stuff in here and the reasonably ingenious employment of it to try and prove guilt for someone who's completely innocent, by the way, that sort of elevated it above my not liking The Third Policeman. So I gave it 3 stars. It was a fun enough, quick read. As you can see, it's a small edition book, but it wasn't great shakes, really. And on to Cees Nooteboom, The Following Story, which I saw Bob the Bookerer talk about, and it turned me onto this. And this is one of 2 books, the other being the Gospodinov, which really got my grey matter working, and for which I appreciate that. So this is about a Dutchman who wakes up one morning in surroundings he recognises, but not his regular surroundings, not where he went to bed the night before. And that is in Lisbon, in Portugal, and that he had a torrid affair there in his earlier life. He was a teacher of the classics in a school in Portugal, and he was very passionate about the classics, and he, the way he taught his kids, even though he himself was unprepossessing in every single other facet, the way he taught his kids was with this sort of great passionate enacting out of the poetry of Horace and Ovid and people like this. So that time in Portugal represented a great passionate life. And gradually, as he's trying to figure out why he's back in Portugal when the night before he went to bed in Amsterdam, it's a way of telling his story of sort of reconnecting with memory, because obviously he remembers the stuff and he reconstructs the stuff in his mind of his life in Portugal, that life of passion, whereas now in Amsterdam he's pretty much forsworn off sex and relationships. He just sits and reads the classics, in a very lonely life. So it's a book about memory, or at least the first half of it is, and it's beautifully done. There's lots of interesting ideas about the nature of memory. But then in the second half of the book, he's on this ship with others, and it's not quite clear sort of what level of reality it is. But gradually you realise this is a sort of some sort of modern day version of crossing the river Styx into the underworld. This is ultimately a book about death, and that somehow the memories that he's recreated, particularly of Portugal, but also to a lesser extent of Amsterdam, are what he's wrangling with for the duration of this boat trip. So I just thought this was a fabulous little book, very sort of contemplative, quite introspective, and just beautifully done. 5 stars. And since I said the other book that worked me over intellectually was Gospodinov, this is my second of his novels. I think this is tighter than the other one, which I also gave 5 stars to. That's called The Physics of Sorrow. I think this is a 5-star read. It's even better. It's more streamlined. So ostensibly, it's sort of semi-autobiographical or auto-fiction or whatever, but told in such an ingenious way. And the main event is the guy's marriage of 7 or 8 years has fallen apart, and he's trying to come to terms with that. But the way he layers and builds it up is just supreme. He talks about bees and flies. He talks about toilets and public toilets and graffiti. He talks about languages, the non-verbal language of bees, flies, flowers. And you think, well, this is all very random, very fractured. But actually, as you progress through the book, you see how he layers these interconnecting images as he struggles to really sort of put together the sort of shattered fragments of a life, of existence, what it means to be human, what it means to be in relationships, and all these sorts of things. It's just supremely well done. Again, another short read. Get through this very quickly, like in fact all the books that I read this week. But this guy has a winning style. He has some fascinating ideas that may not be radical in the sense of reflecting on the nature of humanity, but the way he does it artistically, and his literary formalism as the way, as I say, that he layers these metaphors and these imagistic ways of thinking, because in a way he's sort of after a non-verbal way of trying to penetrate the truths of life, and yet he's written a book which is obviously by definition verbal, but it's just brilliantly done. This is An Untouched House, which was sent to me by, again, another one of my regular commenters, Mitch Axler over in Florida. This is a Dutch book set in the Second World War. It's unspecified exactly where it takes place, but it's when the Germans are on the retreat and the Russians are sort of chasing, driving them back. And initially this is a group of partisans who are allied to the Russian forces. And they come from all over Europe, including the main protagonist is Dutch, but they're from Macedonia and other places. But their existence is rather perilous, because not obviously they can get shot by the Germans that they're fighting, but equally the Russians and Stalin's sort of ideological purity can have them dragged away by the Russian forces and shot as some sort of traitor or whatever. Anyway, so it starts off with a battle scene. The main guy gets separated from the rest of his partisan forces, manages to find this rather beautiful untouched house, and enters it, and just has the idea of actually sort of hiding out because he's become detached from his partisan forces, and the front is shifting backwards and forwards. So he thinks he'll just hide out in this house and, treat himself to some of the privileges he's been denied, such as a bath, fine food, wine, all this sort of stuff. And then the Germans retake the territory and knock at the door, and he sort of impersonates the owner of the house, who he's never met, obviously, pretends it's his house. And the Germans want to bivouac, that's not the right word, but bivouacs their officers there in this fine house, and he agrees. So he has one floor and they have the other. So he's sort of, acting quite carefully. He's stashed away his partisan uniform and his rifle and everything. He's playing the homeowner. But then the homeowner and the homeowner's wife actually turn up, and it looks like they're going to blow the whistle on him. So I don't think this is a spoiler. He sort of ends up killing them both. And at this point, about 2/3 of the way through the novel, it gets increasingly brutal. And this is a commentary about the madness of war, the absurdity of war, and just sort of human nature, really. And I've seen this guy compared to Celine, but without the anti-Semitism. And not that I've read Celine, but obviously I've read around Celine and about Celine. And I can see why people say this, that he has the same sort of almost misanthropy towards the human race. But it's very well done, very well executed, but it's very self-contained. It sets up this framework of the story and the characters, and I didn't feel it managed to expand out of that into a greater picture or a greater understanding. So I gave it 3.5 stars. And on to Standing Heavy by GauZ, the Ivorian. And what an unexpected delight this was. I was in a bookshop browsing, and I saw this on a table. Never heard of the guy. Read the blurb, and something about it appealed to me. So Standing Heavy is the sort of the lingo of people who have jobs where they're on their feet all day. And in this case, it's from the viewpoint of security guards, mainly in sort of department stores. And I think the author has had experience of that. And it's hilarious. It's really, really funny. It's a mixture of 3 chapters of quite epigrammatic writing where he is just throwing these observations about humankind through watching them in department stores. One is a low rent sort of department store in one of the sort of suburbs of France where mainly immigrants live, and the other is a department store on the Champs-Elysees, high end, and he's sort of throwing out these epigrammatic observations about human behaviour in these places, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Just because he's observing human nature, he's paid to observe them because he's got to see if they're stealing stuff, if they're shoplifting. But hilarious. And the other part of it is a slightly sort of historical take on sort of post-colonial politics and immigrants, particularly African immigrants from the former French colonies, but not exclusively. And again, he's very funny, very, very acerbic on the different behaviours of Africans from different countries, the different clothes and the different accents and stuff. There's a laugh on every page. Maybe not a laugh out loud, sort of belly laugh, but you titter on every page. This was such a joy to read. I absolutely raced through it. So I'm just going to read a couple of examples. So he's talking about the sort of the piped muzak in the low rent store that one of the security guards is in. How is it possible to allow such sub-singers to flourish and claim that what they sing is soul when Aretha Franklin is still with us? We no longer afford the illustrious dead the time or the common decency to turn in their graves. These days we insult their memory while they're still alive. And this is about the Bastille Day parade through Paris, and obviously it's a heavily militarised parade. The obelisk on the Place de la Concorde is the hard cock, the Arc de Triomphe is the arsehole, and the Champs-Elysees is the erogenous perineal zone that connects the two. With all these ramrod soldiers and titillated politicians, it is safe to say that today is the day the Republic tosses itself off. The most surprising thing is not the parade of all this lethal weaponry. The surprising thing is the public cheering and applauding. Boredom, feelings of futility and waste, lack of creative outlet, exaggerated aggression response, lack of imagination, infantilization, etc., are the corollaries of a career as a security guard. And yet, a soldier is merely an overblown form of security guard. And it's like that all the way through. I should have said that when I said it was a sort of history of post-colonial politics, there's a lot about the former French colonies and coups and the communities, the political communities who live in Paris. What I didn't realise is there seem to be buildings owned or given, donated by France to the former colonies that aren't the official embassies. They're sort of just buildings. I don't. They might be cultural centres today, but back in the period that he's describing, they were just flop houses for immigrants from that country in a building that was owned by that country's embassy. And so there was a lot of sort of quite radical politics, independence politics, Marxist politics, that sort of thing going on. And he's very interesting on that. Funny as well. A bit like the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, with the popular Judean front and the Judean, the sort of splitters and factions and all of that. All of that was going on. So an absolute delight. And unfortunately, this is the only thing of his so far that is in English. He has written a couple of other books, but just what a joy. And finally, Philippe Claudel, Grey Soul. So this was also sent to me by Mitchell Atzler. So big thank you to Mitchell. And this is a 5-star. Oh, sorry, 5 stars for entertainment value. This is 5 stars in a totally different way. This is a beautiful piece of writing. It's set in the First World War in France. There's a sort of big hill or a small mountain that separates this village or town, which has a strategic munitions factory, so that no one is called up from this town. And on the other side of the hill is where the war is, the front line, and they can hear it and see the see the flashes of the explosions and everything. And in this town, there are three significant deaths during the war period. The first is a murder of a girl. The second is a suicide or an apparent suicide of a teacher in the village, and the third is a death in childbirth of the wife of the policeman, who is sort of formally investigating the crime, but then it sort of goes cold, or what today we'd say is goes cold, but he never quite gives it up. And these other deaths get wrapped into it, at least in his psyche. But it's not about the crime and the murder and stuff. There as background as the war is as well. It sort of permeates every page, both the crime and the war. But it's about French village life of a vanished age, and probably thank God that it's vanished, because we get a beautifully panoply of all the characters in this village, the mayor, the chief of police. But when the girl's first murdered, they bring in the prosecutor to investigate, to see if they can, if there's any case to be made against the murderer, if they can find him. And the other major character the prosecutor rubs up against is the judge, who, the prosecutor has managed to secure guilty verdicts that have sentenced many men to their death by guillotine, which is the sentence imposed by the judge. So you have these two who cannot stand each other. They are at war. And then there's a third, because this is a time of war, a colonel is brought in to sort of oversee the investigation. And the colonel and the prosecutor they're certainly upper middle class, if not aristocratic. And their privilege is it's drawn in such a brilliant way. It's just so ugly, the way they treat the people who, a couple of conscripts who have basically gone AWOL. They're picked up and they're accused of the crime, even though they had nothing to do with it. But the way they are dealt with by these two privileged aristocrats, and the way the policeman is dealt with. So it's all about class and class distinctions, which, have changed since 1914, 15, 16. It's not quite like that now, but it's just a brilliant portrait of the relationships of all these different characters in the village, and it conjures up a wonderful evocation of a lost world, or I assume a lost world. As I say, probably not lost for the worse. It's probably good that it's gone, but I was just gripped, not by the thriller element, but by this building up of this portrait of this particular society. So just wonderful, wonderful stuff. 5 stars. And I'm just going to give you an example of the writing. So they're talking about the key. It's not a chateau, but it's called a chateau, where the prosecutor lives as a widower. His wife died young, and he has a very secluded life in there. And after he dies, the chateau is sort of kept on by his staff, married couple, but when they die, it is abandoned. That the prosecutor had lived there, that Barb had, and Solem too, didn't matter one whit. Vacancy could be felt before you crossed the threshold. The chateau was itself deceased, having stopped breathing ages ago, stopped resounding with the sound of steps, of voices, of laughter, of murmurs, of arguments, of dreams, and of sighs. And there's lots of beautiful writing like that. So, tremendous. And the books, all of them, attest to the skills of the translators, because the author's skill with language in their own native tongues is brought into English by these translators. So top job by all the translators today. So there you have it. I'm still reading James Baldwin, Another Country. I'm about to have a bath and finish my 3rd week of where we agreed to check in, and that will mean next week I will finish it. I now have, after tomorrow, Friday, I now have 2 weeks annual leave in which to complete my own novel, and fingers crossed that's looking pretty good. But it does mean I will not be doing any reading other than the Baldwin. I can't imagine, even though I've got lots of books that have just arrived or are about to arrive that I'm really looking forward to getting to. But it's possible I might, if I'm successful in writing during the day, I might read in the evenings. But I'm not holding my breath. And one of the books I have got is David Moxon's Springer's Progress. What a fantastic cover that is. Looking forward to reading this, but it has to wait. And doesn't he look young there? If you compare the author photo on the front of This Is Not a Novel and other novels, where he does look very old. I mean, there is 20 years apart, so it's hardly surprising, more than 20 years maybe. So it's hardly surprising. But I've got so many books, Baubles books, but I will be hopefully maintaining discipline to write, and the reading will trail in a poor second. So there you have it. Till next time, whenever that may be. Thanks very much.